When you first look at Raphael's School of Athens, you see the gathering of history's greatest minds: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and a host of other philosophers immortalized on frescoed walls. But what if I told you one philosopher is missing? Not just absent from the painting, but absent from history itself. No writings survive. No records of teaching remain. And yet, whispers in ancient archives suggest he was there, shaping ideas that would ripple through centuries. Some scholars call him the lost voice of classical thought. Others insist he never existed. But then, fragments of letters, marginal notes in forgotten manuscripts, and subtle references by other philosophers hint at the same chilling truth. He was deliberately erased. And what he knew, or taught, was so controversial that entire generations of thinkers were instructed to forget him. The story begins in Athens, 4th century BCE, the city of marble, ideals, and intellectual revolutions. The Academy of Plato was already famous, its gardens echoing with debates about ethics, mathematics, and metaphysics. Plato's students included Aristotle, who would go on to shape the very foundations of logic, science, and philosophy. But few remember that alongside these celebrated figures walked another mind, a thinker who refused to align with Plato's idealism or Aristotle's empiricism. Some called him Callicrates, though even this name is disputed. He was a philosopher of contradictions, a thinker whose ideas challenged both the gods and the polis. Unlike his peers, he did not seek fame, did not write extensively, and did not allow disciples to publicly repeat his teachings. Instead, he left cryptic marginal notes, scattered dialogues, and private lectures that few attended. According to some accounts, his philosophy centered on what is hidden, the unspoken rules that govern society, power, and the human soul. He argued that most philosophers, Plato included, only scratched the surface, glorifying ideals while ignoring the darker forces shaping human behavior. And it was this very philosophy that would make him dangerous and eventually erased. Records suggest he attended debates where Socrates challenged the powerful of Athens. But while Socrates drew attention for his public interrogations, Callicrates was said to manipulate ideas in silence, guiding some of the most brilliant minds toward conclusions they would not understand until centuries later. Why is he missing from Raphael's fresco, which was painted almost 2 millennia later during the Renaissance? Because the artist drew from texts, sketches, and traditions that were themselves filtered. Callicrates' ideas had been purged, his presence minimized, leaving only the faintest trace in whispers of philosophy. The first clue of his existence comes from a marginal note in a copy of Plato's Republic, discovered in a Roman library. There is one among us who sees beyond the forms, yet he speaks only in shadows. A cryptic reference. Some interpreted it as metaphorical, but others suspected it described someone who truly questioned the foundation of philosophy itself. And that question is the heart of the mystery. Who was Callicrates? And why did every official and scholar work to erase him from memory? Some claim it was fear of the truth he uncovered. Some whisper he predicted events so profound, so destabilizing, that Athens itself would have crumbled if his teachings were fully revealed. But the evidence is scarce. Until recently, a series of forgotten codices in Florence hinted that Callicrates may have been at the Academy when Plato composed the last books of his dialogues, influencing debates about knowledge, perception, and reality in ways never acknowledged. And in these codices, there is a single line, almost lost to time. He who does not appear in the world may yet steer the world's thought. Callicrates was not just missing from Raphael's fresco. He was missing from history itself. Yet the whispers remain, the marginal notes, the subtle shifts in philosophical arguments that cannot be explained by Plato, Aristotle, or their known contemporaries. And that is where our story begins, in the spaces between lines, in the shadows of the Academy, in the mind of a philosopher who refused to be seen, but whose influence may have shaped everything we call Western thought. When Raphael painted the School of Athens between 1509 and 1511, he aimed to capture the spirit of classical wisdom. Every philosopher was chosen carefully, each pose and gesture deliberate. Plato points to the heavens, Aristotle to the earth, a symbolic dance of idealism and pragmatism. But art historians notice something curious. One space among the philosophers seemed intentionally ambiguous. A figure stands slightly apart, features blurred, body turned as if to avoid direct scrutiny. Some dismissed it as an unfinished detail. Others, examining preparatory sketches in the Vatican archives, noticed the same space had been altered repeatedly, lines erased and redrawn. And here's the chilling part. The space corresponds to the historical era of Callicrates. Documents from Raphael's workshop hint that he was working from ancient sketches and accounts of philosophers that had already been filtered by centuries of selective copying. By the Renaissance, Callicrates had been effectively erased from the textual tradition. Yet Raphael may have sensed something. Perhaps he knew a philosopher existed who did not fit the narrative. Perhaps he captured his absence rather than presence, a ghost in marble and fresco. Contemporaneous letters reveal Raphael discussed the missing voice with Cardinal della Rovere, who commissioned the work. The cardinal, known for his extensive humanist library, may have known of texts deliberately suppressed, dialogues that contradicted prevailing interpretations of Plato and Aristotle. One letter reads, "Some men teach in whispers. I wish to show them not, for their lessons are dangerous." Dangerous? Why would a philosopher be considered dangerous 2,000 years later? Historians argue that Callicrates' philosophy touched on concepts that would later disturb both church and state. The limits of reason, arguing that human perception is deeply flawed and controlled by unseen forces. The instability of civic virtue, claiming that cities are not governed by ideals, but by hidden compulsions in the human soul. The impermanence of recorded knowledge, insisting that only fragments survive because societies selectively erase truths. Callicrates' influence may be encoded in subtle details in Raphael's fresco, the placement of philosophers in isolated groups, suggesting unseen hierarchies of thought. The gestures of those listening, hinting that some arguments were deliberately ignored. Even the angle of light across the fresco, drawing attention away from certain figures. And the most unsettling clue comes from a recently uncovered codex in Florence, a commentary describing a meeting of scholars in the Academy, where Callicrates allegedly challenged Plato directly on the nature of truth. According to the note, Plato's words were answered not with opposition, but with silence. Yet all present knew the answer was given, hidden in plain sight. This aligns with the theory that Callicrates was not only present, but radically influential, shaping the debates of the Academy without leaving traditional records. By the time Raphael's sketches were copied for the fresco, centuries of erasure had taken their toll. Callicrates' presence survived only in absence. The figure left blank, blurred, as though history itself refused to acknowledge him. And yet, some fragments hint that Callicrates may have left private disciples. Names like Callias, Theon, and Leontios appear sporadically in obscure marginal notes, students who may have transmitted his ideas quietly. Could it be that these unacknowledged thinkers carried forward Callicrates' teachings, hiding revolutionary ideas in plain sight for future generations? If so, his absence from Raphael's fresco becomes not a mistake, but a message. The philosopher who was missing still shaped the intellectual world, but only those attuned to the gaps could perceive it. The mystery deepens when considering the lost dialogues attributed to Callicrates, texts that supposedly questioned the foundation of ethics, the reliability of history, the very nature of memory itself, and according to one Byzantine copyist, these dialogues were deliberately destroyed because they threatened the authority of all who claimed to know. Which raises the question, what ideas were so dangerous that a philosopher could be erased from history and from a masterpiece that sought to immortalize all others? By the end of the 4th century BCE, Callicrates had become an enigma even among the intellectual elite of Athens. He was known to frequent the Academy, the Lyceum, and even private gatherings of scholars in wealthy households, yet no public lecture or formal teaching record survived. Some contemporaries wrote of him in hushed tones, describing a man whose intellect was so sharp it unsettled kings and philosophers alike. One fragmentary account from a lost treatise on ethics reads, "He speaks as if he knows the currents beneath thought itself, yet he leaves no trace for others to follow. To follow him is to vanish with him." The phrase "vanish with him" would prove prophetic. Callicrates' disappearance is as mysterious as his teachings. Some historians suggest he deliberately withdrew from public life, fearing that the exposure of his ideas could be misused or even condemned. Others hint at darker forces, political rivals, jealous philosophers, or even rulers who feared destabilization of their authority. By the late Hellenistic period, his name was almost entirely absent from philosophical compendiums. Where Plato and Aristotle were cited repeatedly, Callicrates appeared only as a shadowy footnote, if at all. Yet his influence persisted, scattered in whispers. Some dialogues attributed to Plato bear subtle annotations suggesting alternate interpretations, ideas that could be traced to Callicrates. Marginalia in Roman copies of Greek texts hint at secret teachings passed from master to student. Codices found in Constantinople and Florence include cryptic references to a silent teacher, likely Callicrates, whose works were dangerous for the masses. The most intriguing account comes from a 6th century Byzantine scholar, Hieronymus of Ephesus, who wrote, "There was one among the Athenians who knew the limits of memory and history itself. When he departed, it was not he who vanished, but all who attempted to hold him." This cryptic note aligns with later evidence that Callicrates may have predicted the systematic erasure of his presence. Why would a philosopher go to such lengths to hide himself? The answer lies in his teachings about the fragility of knowledge. Callicrates argued that recorded history, written words, and even public memory were susceptible to manipulation. He suggested that ideas could be controlled or erased, and that power often lay in what is omitted rather than what is spoken. By this logic, his disappearance was not a failure, it was a continuation of his philosophy. He became both subject and lesson, an example of how truth can be hidden in plain sight, existing only in subtle traces, whispers, and absences. Some surviving fragments suggest he also warned about the dangers of imitation. Plato's followers, Hieronymus notes, repeat the words, yet the meaning flees. Callicrates may have intended for only the careful observer, those who notice the gaps, the shadows, and the silences, to understand the full depth of his ideas. The result, centuries of philosophers, historians, and artists attempting to reconstruct him, only to find absence as the central clue. And yet, even in this absence, a pattern emerges. Callicrates questioned the nature of reality and perception. He explored hidden forces that govern human behavior. He hinted at truths suppressed by power, forgotten by time, and invisible to those unwilling to see. The mystery now stretches across 2 millennia. Raphael's fresco, the Lost Dialogues, the Byzantine Marginalia, they all point to the same truth. Callicrates was there, shaping thought, influencing minds, and yet, he refused to exist in history on conventional terms. And this leads to the most haunting question. If a philosopher can vanish entirely, leaving only shadows of his teachings, what else has history erased that could alter our understanding of the past? In the next part, we will explore the hidden teachings Callicrates left behind and the forbidden ideas that the Academy and later generations tried to suppress. Despite Callicrates' disappearance, fragments of his work survived, mostly in private collections, obscure codices, and marginal notes, and they reveal a philosophy radically different from anything known in classical Athens. Unlike Plato, who focused on ideals, or Aristotle, who emphasized observation and categorization, Callicrates examined the mechanisms beneath knowledge itself. He asked, why do societies remember certain truths but erase others? How do power, fear, and self-interest shape philosophy? What is concealed in the silence between words? Some fragments suggest he even challenged the existence of objective truth, claiming that what civilizations call wisdom is often a mask for consensus imposed by the powerful. One surviving line reads, "To know what men know is easy. To know what men choose not to know is the true task of a philosopher." Callicrates' dialogues, though mostly lost, reportedly contained lessons intended for the most discerning students. He used paradoxes, allegories, and deliberately contradictory statements, forcing listeners to think beyond conventional frameworks. And here lies the danger that led to his erasure. Some of his writings hinted that even Plato and Aristotle could be misled, that the foundations of philosophy were not as firm as they appeared. According to a Byzantine codex, he suggested that the academy itself could become a prison of thought, limiting understanding by valorizing certain ideas while suppressing others. In one allegorical fragment, he describes a hall of statues, each representing a philosopher, yet one figure is absent. The allegory concludes, "The one who is missing holds the key to all the rest." Those who see only the visible will never understand. Could this be why Raphael left a blurred space in the fresco? Was the missing figure intentionally immortalized as absence, reflecting the philosophical truth Callicrates embodied? Further fragments describe forbidden dialogues, conversations Callicrates claimed would destabilize both thought and society. He questioned morality, the nature of power, and the reliability of history itself, often concluding that truth is both fragile and dangerous. The surviving notes hint at a method he called the tracing of shadows, a way of studying the gaps, omissions, and silences in texts and traditions to uncover hidden truths. This method may explain how his teachings survived despite deliberate suppression. Students and scribes preserved fragments in codes, allegories, and metaphors, leaving breadcrumbs for those capable of discerning them. But Callicrates' ultimate warning was clear: ideas, once discovered, cannot be wholly destroyed. Yet if the world is unprepared, they may consume it instead of liberating it. It was this warning, likely understood by Raphael's contemporaries, that made Callicrates dangerous to all institutions, philosophical, religious, and political. It explains why his name, writings, and even image were deliberately erased from history. And yet, paradoxically, the very act of erasure ensured his influence survived in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Philosophical movements questioning authority centuries later, humanist scholars during the Renaissance rediscovering critical thinking codices, marginal notes, and fragmented texts inspiring inquiry long after the originals vanished. Callicrates' lesson was woven into the spaces between words, the silences between thinkers, and the absences in art itself. And this leads us to the final, haunting revelation. The philosopher who was missing did not merely vanish. He became a guardian of hidden knowledge, a presence only discernible to those who know how to look. The question remains, who else has been erased from history, and what truths lie in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered? Centuries have passed since Callicrates walked the streets of Athens, debated in the academy, and disappeared from the pages of history. Yet his absence continues to speak. Art historians, poring over Raphael's School of Athens, still notice the ambiguous figure, blurred and isolated, as if the painter had intentionally immortalized the void left by the missing philosopher. Codices in Florence, Constantinople, and even obscure monasteries in Mount Athos preserve fragments of his teachings, enigmatic marginalia, cryptic allegories, and references to the tracing of shadows. Callicrates' philosophy challenges us to see that history is never complete, that the stories we inherit are shaped as much by omission as by inclusion. He questioned not only the content of knowledge but the mechanisms that govern what is remembered and what is erased. Some scholars argue that Callicrates' absence is a lesson in itself, that the true philosopher may not seek fame, recognition, or immortality, but instead shapes thought silently, in the spaces between others' understanding. Consider this. When we study the great minds of history, how many voices have been lost, deliberately or by accident? How many radical ideas were erased, only to survive in whispers and shadows? Callicrates reminds us that absence can be more revealing than presence, that the invisible hand of a thinker may guide centuries of intellectual development, even without a single surviving book or portrait. And so the School of Athens, for all its grandeur, contains a secret, The missing philosopher is not a flaw in the fresco. He is a message encoded in absence, a testament to the fragility of history, and a challenge to every observer. Look closely. Notice the spaces. Question the gaps. Because in those gaps may lie truths powerful enough to change the way we understand philosophy, society, and ourselves. And one last question lingers, as it has for over 2,000 years. What else has history erased? And will we ever be able to find it before it is lost forever?